What if one ordinary flight became the moment your worth was questioned simply because of the color of your skin? Picture this: you're sitting quietly, ticket in hand, minding your own business, and suddenly someone points at you, accusing you of being suspicious. No reason, no evidence, just fear disguised as concern. What would you do? Stay silent or stand tall and face it head on? That's exactly what happened to Dr. Adrian Cole, a calm and composed black man on his way home after a long week. When a passenger demanded he be removed, the cabin turned tense, judgment hanging thick in the air. But what came next silenced everyone. Adrian didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. He simply opened his wallet and revealed the truth, his FBI badge. Yet this isn't just about a moment of shock, it's about what came after. About the choice to respond with dignity instead of rage, grace instead of revenge. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stay kind in the face of cruelty. Would you have had the same strength? Stay with us. This story will challenge what you believe about respect, justice, and quiet courage. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. The morning light at Seattle-Tacoma International was soft, the kind that didn't shout but slowly unfolded across polished floors and tired faces. 6:40 a.m., and the terminal hummed with quiet impatience, rolling suitcases, yawning travelers, the hiss of espresso machines fighting the fatigue of another Monday. Dr. Adrian Cole stood near Gate 27, black duffel resting against his leg, a paper cup of coffee in one hand. He wasn't tall in an intimidating way, but there was something about him, composure wrapped in stillness. He observed the world with calm eyes that had seen both chaos and beauty, and learned not to flinch from either. He'd been home only 3 days. Helix Dynamics. The cybersecurity firm he founded after leaving the bureau had just finalized a federal contract, the kind of deal that would keep his team running for years. But Adrian had never been good at celebration. His mind ran on quiet duty, keeping systems safe, people safe. Even on his off days, he couldn't stop scanning the edges of a crowd. He adjusted the strap of his watch, exhaled, and looked at the departure screen. Flight 482 to Washington, D.C., on time. A good sign. He smiled faintly. Maybe this one would be peaceful. Across the waiting area, a woman in a beige cardigan clutched her boarding pass like a lifeline. Her name, he didn't know yet, was Margaret Sloan. 55, teacher turned widow, flying east to visit her son. Her eyes flicked nervously from the gate to the people around her, the way someone might scan for exits without realizing it. Years of watching news headlines about danger had taught her that fear was safety. When boarding began, Adrian waited, as he always did, until most passengers had gone ahead. No rush. He preferred to be the calm in the stream rather than the one pushing through it. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," the gate agent said, scanning his pass. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and even. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the metallic scent of fuel mixing with recycled air. Row 12A, window seat. He stowed his briefcase, sleek black, reinforced corners, and sat down, glancing out at the wing lit by sunrise. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the stillness settle in. The quiet didn't last long. "Excuse me." The voice came hesitant but sharp around the edges. Adrian opened his eyes. Standing beside him was the woman from the gate, the beige cardigan, the anxious eyes. "I think you might be in my seat." He blinked once, checked his ticket, then looked up. 12A. he said calmly, showing it to her. Her eyes darted to her own pass. "Oh," she murmured. "I'm sorry. I'm 12B. He nodded politely and slid back, allowing her to pass. She sat down with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, then pulled her tote close to her lap like she was guarding something fragile. Adrian turned toward the window again. Outside, the ground crew signaled. Luggage carts moved, and the morning seemed to hum along. But inside, a subtle shift began. He could feel it the way silence thickens between two people when one has already decided something about the other. Margaret fidgeted with her seatbelt, glancing sideways at him in quick, guilty intervals. She didn't say a word, but the tension between them grew, almost physical. Adrian pretended not to notice. He'd lived through enough boardrooms, checkpoints, and polite rejections to know what this was. Not fear of him as a man, fear of him as an idea. He breathed out slowly, letting it pass, or trying to. The intercom crackled. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 482 to Washington, D&C. We expect clear skies and a smooth flight time of 4 hours and 20 minutes. As the flight attendants began the safety demo, Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes again. For a brief second, he thought of his daughter, Maya, 10 years old, fearless, always asking why people judged before knowing. He'd told her once that the world learns slowly, but it learns. He hoped that was true. A soft thud broke his thought. Margaret had dropped her tote bag. Papers scattered at her feet. Adrian reached down instinctively, gathering them before she could. "Oh, you don't have to," she stammered. "It's all right," he said, handing them back. His tone was kind, even gentle. She gave a nervous laugh. "I'm just a little clumsy." He nodded. "Happens to all of us," but her eyes flickered down to his briefcase, then back up. "That's quite a case you've got there," she said. "Work documents," he replied simply. She nodded, but didn't seem comforted. "You travel a lot enough," Adrian said. She forced another smile. "Right." He could hear the layers behind her tone, the polite mask, the unease she couldn't name. He turned back to the window, jaw tightening. He didn't want this conversation. Not again. Not today. 5 rows back, a young man in a hoodie. Jordan Lewis watched quietly. He'd noticed the exchange, recognized the pattern. His phone rested face down on the tray, but his thumb hovered near the camera icon. By the time the plane pushed back from the gate, Adrian's muscles were tense beneath his calm. He told himself to breathe, to let it slide, to stay invisible. But fate had a way of making quiet men visible in the loudest possible ways. Outside, the engines roared to life. Inside, one woman's fear would soon turn into accusation, and one man's patience into revelation. And somewhere between Seattle and Washington, D.C., a story the world had seen too many times was about to unfold again, only this time. Someone would finally freeze long enough to see herself clearly. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 482 began taxiing, and a hush rolled through the plane, broken only by the rhythmic murmur of the safety announcements. Dr. Adrian Cole adjusted his seatbelt and leaned back. For a moment, the hum of the engines felt like peace, the kind of mechanical lull that drowned out thought. He needed that, needed to forget contracts, politics, and the endless dance of proving himself in rooms where he was seen first and heard later. Margaret Sloane sat rigid beside him. Her fingers toyed with the corner of her boarding pass until it started to tear. She didn't understand why her chest felt so tight. She told herself it wasn't about him, it couldn't be. But her eyes kept drifting toward the black briefcase under his seat, that quiet, sturdy box that looked like it held something important or dangerous. Adrian noticed. Of course. Years of federal work had trained him to see what people tried to hide the flicker of suspicion, the way tension builds in silence. He thought about saying something to ease her nerves, then decided against it. People like Margaret didn't need reassurance from him. They needed to sit long enough with their discomfort to see where it came from. The seatbelt light flicked off. Flight attendants began their routine smiles rehearsed, voices too cheerful for this hour. Across the aisle, Jordan Lewis caught Adrian's gaze and gave him a small, understanding nod, the kind that said, "I see it too." Margaret pretended not to notice either of them, but inside, her mind raced. The man beside her was too quiet, too still, and that briefcase, it hadn't moved since he boarded. She tried to tell herself she was being silly, but the thought rooted itself, steady as fear often does. When the beverage cart reached their row, Adrian ordered black coffee. Margaret asked for ginger ale, her voice tremoring slightly. The flight attendant smiled and moved on. For a few blessed minutes, there was peace. The sky beyond the windows had turned a pale gold, streaked with the first hints of light. Then, as if the quiet itself unnerved her, Margaret spoke. "So, what kind of work do you do?" Adrian turned from the window, polite but distant. "Cybersecurity." "Oh," she said, forcing a laugh. "That sounds complicated." "It can be," he replied evenly. She hesitated. "You work for the government?" He took a sip of coffee, not answering right away. "Used to." Something in his tone, calm, precise, not evasive but careful, made her pulse quicken. "Used to." He nodded once. "Now I run a private firm. We consult on infrastructure protection, airports, hospitals, defense systems." Margaret's throat tightened. Airports. Defense. The words collided with every half-remembered news story she'd absorbed over the years. Her imagination began to write its own script. She forced a smile that faltered halfway. Important work. "It matters," Adrian said quietly. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. Margaret's eyes flicked toward his briefcase. Her mind painted pictures she didn't want to see. She told herself it was instinct, not prejudice. "I'm just cautious," she thought. Anyone would be, but the truth, if she dared to face it, was simpler. The man beside her didn't look like the kind of person she'd ever been told to trust. She pressed the call button. A flight attendant, blonde, mid-20s, named Melissa, appeared moments later, cheerful but curious. "Yes," Ma'am Margaret lowered her voice. I don't want to cause trouble, but I'm feeling uncomfortable in my seat." Melissa blinked. Uncomfortable how Margaret hesitated. "It's just the man next to me. He's acting strange, very quiet, and that briefcase, he said it has government documents." Melissa followed her glance, eyes landing on Adrian. He looked up calmly, expression unreadable. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. Margaret interjected. "He said he used to work for the government, and I don't know, it's just..." Adrian turned fully toward her then, voice low but steady. "Ma'am, if you have a question for me, you can ask me directly." Her cheeks flushed. "I didn't mean anything by it." "Then maybe let's keep it that way," he said. tone neither harsh nor soft, just firm. Melissa shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, unless there's a safety concern, I can't reseat you right now. We're full." Margaret gave a tight nod, pretending to accept the answer, but her mind was already building another story. She leaned closer to Melissa and whispered, "Can you just keep an eye?" Please, Melissa offered a polite smile and moved on. Jordan Lewis watched the whole thing unfold. He caught Adrian's eye again, mouthed a silent sorry. "Man." Adrian's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak. He'd been through this before. Too many airports, too many assumptions. He stared out the window, at clouds blurring past like slow motion. Beneath the surface, something in him cracked. Not anger, something quieter. Fatigue. He thought of his father, a postal worker who'd once been detained at an airport because his name matched someone on a list. He thought of every conversation where he'd had to defend his tone, his presence, his right to take up space. He closed his eyes. Breathe. Adrian. Let it pass. But the universe wasn't done testing his restraint. 20 minutes later, another flight attendant arrived, older, crisp uniform, name tag reading Laura Pierce. Her expression carried authority. "Sir," she began, "could I verify your boarding pass again?" Adrian looked at her, calm but weary. "Is there a problem?" "Not necessarily," she said quickly. "We just received a report from a passenger feeling unsafe." He exhaled, slow and deliberate. "You mean her?" Laura didn't answer. "May I see your ID?" "Please." Jordan's phone was already in his hand. His thumb hovered above the record button. He'd seen where this was going. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his boarding pass. "Seat 12A, he said. "Same one it's been since I boarded." Laura scanned it, then returned it. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your cooperation." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, realizing other passengers were beginning to stare. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she said softly. Adrian turned toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time with something colder than anger. "Truth. You already did." Her lips parted, but no sound came. Laura cleared her throat. "Everything appears fine. Let's all just relax and enjoy the flight." The tension didn't fade. It deepened. When Laura walked away, Adrian looked down at his briefcase, then back at the woman beside him. He wanted to feel safe, he said quietly, but at whose expense? She froze, guilt rising like heat. "I wasn't trying to. I know," he interrupted. "That's what makes it worse. For the rest of the flight." She said nothing. Neither did he. The air between them thickened until it was almost a third presence, something invisible but undeniable. Jordan finally hit record, not to expose, but to remember. He wanted people to see what quiet injustice looked like, not shouting or violence, just the steady erosion of dignity under the weight of someone else's fear. Outside, the plane sliced through clouds like an arrow. Inside, two people sat inches apart, worlds away from each other. Margaret stared at her trembling hands. Adrian stared out at the horizon, somewhere over the Midwest. Truth and prejudice sat side by side, each pretending not to exist. But turbulence, as fate would have it, was coming, and it wouldn't come from the sky. The seatbelt light flickered on just as the plane leveled off above the clouds. A low rumble filled the cabin, steady and hypnotic, the kind of sound that made people close their eyes and drift. But there was no calm in row 12. Adrian Cole sat still, every sense tuned sharp. He could feel Margaret Sloane beside him, her breathing shallow, her hands clenched in her lap. The silence between them had turned from awkward to electric, humming with something unsaid. Margaret stared at the tray table, replaying the last hour in her head. Every time she'd tried to convince herself she'd overreacted. Her eyes slid toward that black briefcase and the thought came crawling back. He's hiding something. It wasn't logic. It was fear disguised as instinct. And fear, once it takes root, doesn't listen to reason. When Laura Pierce passed again with her clipboard, Margaret raised her hand before she could stop herself. "Excuse me," she whispered. Laura paused. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret swallowed. I still don't feel comfortable. I think maybe we should check that case." The air seemed to thicken. Adrian turned his head slowly, his calm so controlled it frightened her more than anger would have. "Is there a specific concern?" Laura asked carefully. Margaret's voice trembled. "He said it has government files. He's very quiet. He keeps watching everyone." Laura glanced at Adrian, who met her eyes without flinching. "I'm watching the window," he said softly. A few passengers nearby began to murmur. A man in 13C turned his head, curious. A teenager leaned out from row 11, earbuds dangling. The tension spread like ripples in water. Laura sighed. "All right, ma'am. I'll let the captain know. Please stay seated." As she walked toward the front, Adrian pinched the bridge of his nose. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He'd seen this movie too many times. The plot never changed. Only the cast. Jordan across the aisle met his eyes. "You okay?" "Man," he mouthed. Adrian nodded once, though his pulse told a different story. He wanted to believe this would resolve quietly. But the whisper network inside airplanes had its own velocity. By the time Laura reached the cockpit, half the first-class cabin already sensed something was wrong. 10 minutes later, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be holding at altitude for a few minutes due to a security check requested by the cabin crew." A collective groan filled the air. Margaret's heart pounded. She hadn't meant for all this. She just wanted someone to look, to confirm, so she could stop feeling afraid. But now her fear had turned into spectacle. Laura returned with a man in a navy blazer and badge clipped to his belt, Greg Hanley, the in-flight security officer. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind that told you he'd done this before. He stopped beside row 12. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you a few questions," he said calmly. Adrian looked up, voice measured. "Is this voluntary or am I being detained?" Greg hesitated. "You're not being detained. We just had a report of suspicious behavior." Adrian's eyes flicked toward Margaret, then back. "I see." He straightened slowly, his tone steady as a surgeon's hand. "Let me guess. I'm suspicious because I'm quiet, have a briefcase, and don't fit the profile of who she thinks belongs in this seat." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The truth always lands heavier than accusation. Greg cleared his throat. "We just want to ensure everyone's safety." "Of course," Adrian said. "Then perhaps start with facts." He unlatched his seatbelt and leaned down, lifting the briefcase with deliberate care. He set it on his lap and looked up. "Would you like me to open it?" Margaret froze. She hadn't expected that. She wanted reassurance, not confrontation. Greg shook his head. "That won't be necessary yet." "Good," Adrian said quietly, "because I'm not going to." A hush rippled through the cabin. The words weren't loud, but they carried. Greg stiffened. Sir Adrian's tone didn't change. Unless you're TSA or federal law enforcement, you have no jurisdiction to search personal property. You know that. Jordan's phone was recording again, subtle behind his tray. Greg hesitated, caught between procedure and pride. I'll have to radio the ground. Please do, Adrian said. But before you do, I think there's something you should see. He reached into his jacket pocket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a black leather ID wallet. He opened it, revealing a flash of gold and blue. The seal was unmistakable. Dr. Adrian Cole, former special agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was almost holy. Even the engine seemed to dull. Greg blinked. You're retired, Adrian said, voice calm but edged with steel. Now a consultant for Homeland Infrastructure. I'm flying to D.C. for a classified audit briefing. That's what's in the case, documents with clearance levels you can't authorize to open. Margaret's mouth fell open. I didn't know. You didn't ask, he said simply. Greg cleared his throat. Understood, sir. I'll confirm immediately. He stepped toward the front, his voice lower now, deferential, all around them. Passengers exchanged glances, some embarrassed, some curious, others uncomfortable with how quickly sympathy had shifted. Margaret's cheeks burned. I'm so sorry. Adrian looked at her, not unkindly but with exhaustion that went deeper than anger. You thought you were protecting people. I've heard that before. Her eyes filled. I didn't mean harm. He sighed softly. You don't have to mean harm for harm to happen. Laura returned minutes later, breathless. Expression changed. Captain Tanner sends his apologies. Dr. Cole, everything's confirmed. Please accept his thanks for your service. Adrian nodded, then leaned back against the headrest. Let's just get to D.C. Laura gave a small nod and walked away. The whispers resumed, now colored with awkward admiration. Someone muttered, FBI, damn, under their breath. Another said, she really messed up. Margaret wanted to disappear. She sat small in her seat, staring at her trembling hands. Adrian closed his eyes, but peace wouldn't come. Every time something like this happened, it left a bruise that didn't show. He wasn't angry, just weary. After a few minutes, a shadow crossed the aisle. Jordan stood there, phone tucked in his hoodie pocket. Hey, man, he said softly, just wanted to say, the way you handled that respect. Adrian opened his eyes, gave a tired smile. Thanks. I wish it wasn't practice. Jordan nodded slowly. Yeah, me too. When he returned to his seat, Margaret finally spoke again, voice barely a whisper. You must think I'm awful. Adrian didn't look at her. I think you're human. That's the problem and the hope. She frowned, not understanding. Humans learn, he said. Eventually, the rest of the flight passed in uneasy quiet. No one mentioned the incident again. But everyone felt its echo, the kind of silence that follows truth when it lands too close. As the plane began its descent, the clouds parted, revealing the silver thread of the Potomac below. Margaret looked out the window, her reflection pale against the glass. For the first time, she saw not the man beside her, but herself, how fear had puppeteered her into cruelty. Adrian leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, watching the earth rise to meet them. He wondered how many times he'd have to flash that badge before people saw him, not his title. When they touched down, applause rippled from the back, a nervous tradition. Margaret didn't join in. Her hands were clasped, trembling. She turned to him, tears caught in her voice. "I'll never forget this. I promise." Adrian gave a faint nod. "Make sure it's for the right reason." The engines roared down, the plane slowing, the runway stretching out ahead, a road home for some, a reckoning for others. Outside, the morning sun hit the windows, turning the cabin gold. For a moment, it looked like forgiveness. The cabin lights brightened as the plane taxied toward the gate. Passengers stirred from uneasy silence, gathering bags, stretching limbs, pretending nothing had happened. But beneath the rustle of coats and the thud of overhead bins, a different quiet pulsed raw, embarrassed, human. Adrian Cole stayed seated, letting the aisle fill. He'd learned that people who rush to exit are the same ones who rush to judge. He preferred patience. It revealed more truth than anger ever could. Margaret Sloane remained beside him, her face turned to the window. Her reflection trembled against the glass, half shadow, half shame. She wanted to say something, anything, but every word she rehearsed in her mind felt smaller than the damage she'd caused. When the seatbelt light finally blinked off, people began to move. Jordan Lewis stood, retrieved his backpack, and gave Adrian a small nod. "Take care, man," he said quietly. Adrian nodded back. "You too." As Jordan disappeared up the aisle, Adrian noticed Greg Hanley, the in-flight security officer, waiting by the cockpit door, phone pressed to his ear. His eyes caught Adrian's for a brief second, a silent acknowledgement that some apologies didn't fit into words. Adrian gave a small nod in return, then looked away. Margaret turned at last. "Dr. Cole, I know there's nothing I can say to undo this, but I'm sorry, truly." He met her eyes, calm but distant. "I believe you," he said, "but you'll need to do more than apologize. You'll need to remember." She hesitated. "I will." He gave a faint smile, not unkind. "Good, because the next person won't have a badge." Her breath caught. The truth of that landed harder than anything else he could have said. When the door opened and passengers began filing out, Adrian waited until almost everyone had left before standing. He lifted his briefcase, slipped on his jacket, and moved toward the front. The flight attendants stood like uneasy statues. Laura Pierce's voice trembled slightly as she said, "Thank you for flying with us. Dr. Cole." He paused, studying her face not with anger, but with quiet understanding. "You did your job," he said. "Next time, maybe remember what safety really means." Laura lowered her gaze. "Yes, sir." As Adrian stepped off the plane, the air in the jet bridge felt heavy and too warm. 2 airport police officers stood at the gate, talking to Greg Hanley. When they saw Adrian, their posture softened. "Dr. Cole," one asked. "We were briefed. You're clear to go, sir." Adrian inclined his head. "Thank you." But as he walked toward the terminal, he could feel eyes following him. Not all suspicious, some curious, others guilty. The incident had already leaked into whispers, and whispers have a way of growing wings. He reached the concourse, where sunlight spilled through tall glass panels. Travelers moved in waves, coffee cups, phones, deadlines, lives intersecting for seconds before diverging again. Adrian paused by a window, watching a child press her face to the glass, waving at planes. Her innocence made his chest ache. He'd once believed the world could outgrow fear, but days like this reminded him that prejudice was a virus mutating, surviving, disguised as protection. His phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor Briggs, his chief operations officer at Helix Dynamics, saw the alert. "You okay? News might pick it up. Want us to handle PR." Adrian exhaled through his nose, typed back, "Not yet. Let truth speak first." He pocketed the phone and started walking. Meanwhile, in the gate area, Margaret sat alone, waiting for her connecting flight. She couldn't shake the sound of his voice. "The next person won't have a badge." The phrase looped in her mind like a lesson written in permanent ink. A young woman in uniform approached her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Margaret blinked, realizing she'd been crying silently. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just thinking." The attendant hesitated. "If you need to file a statement, no." Margaret interrupted. "What I need is to listen." She stood and walked toward the terminal bookstore. Inside, she picked up a small notebook from a shelf and stared at its cover, "Be the Change." It felt too on the nose, but she bought it anyway. Back in D.C., by the time Adrian reached baggage claim, a quiet storm was already brewing. A teenage passenger from row 11 had posted a short video clip of the confrontation, the woman's fearful accusation, Adrian's calm reveal of his FBI badge. The caption read, "She called him suspicious. He called her truth." Within an hour, the clip hit 1 million views. By the time Adrian's driver met him at the curb, reporters were already calling. He ignored them. Inside the car, silence stretched between him and the driver. A young black man named Miles who kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "You're the guy from the flight, aren't you?" Miles asked finally. Adrian's eyes stayed on the passing buildings. "Guess that depends who's asking." Miles chuckled nervously. "No disrespect, sir. Just saw the video. Man, the way you kept calm, I wish I could do that." Adrian gave a weary half-smile. "Calm isn't the absence of anger, it's just discipline." Miles nodded slowly, thinking, "Still takes strength, though. Most people would have lost it." "Losing it doesn't change minds," Adrian said quietly. "It just confirms fears." When they arrived at the Helix Dynamics office, a steel and glass structure tucked near the Potomac, Adrian thanked him and stepped out. The building's mirrored facade caught the sunlight, scattering it across the water. It was supposed to symbolize transparency. Today, it felt ironic. Inside, Eleanor Briggs was waiting in the lobby, tablet in hand. "It's gone viral," she said without preamble. "Yeah, flight, Harnate 2 is trending. People are furious, some defending you, others twisting it into politics. You know how it goes." Adrian sighed. And the airline's silent. For now. He rubbed his temples. "I don't want outrage. I want awareness." Eleanor crossed her arms. "You might not get to choose that." He looked at her, his eyes distant but firm. "Then we'll guide it. This can't just be another story that fades after 3 days." She studied him for a moment. "You're really going to do it, aren't you?" He nodded. "We'll push for a reform initiative bias training for all major airlines, data audits, transparency reports. I'll call it the Clear Flight Project." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You never rest." Adrian's expression softened. "Rest doesn't fix systems." That night, long after the office lights dimmed, Adrian sat alone at his desk, watching the city glow beyond the window. His badge lay beside his laptop, small, gleaming, heavy with meaning. He thought about Margaret Sloane and wondered if she was sleeping or staring at her ceiling, replaying the moment she realized her fear had a face. He didn't hate her. He hated the quiet machinery that built people like her the stories, the news, the inherited suspicion. He picked up the badge, tracing the ridges of its seal. It had once made him invisible in danger. Now it made him visible in prejudice. His phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Dr. Cole. The voice was shaky, familiar. Ms. Sloane, he said quietly. I just wanted to say thank you, she murmured. Not for forgiving me, for not humiliating me. Adrian was silent for a beat. What would that have solved? Maybe nothing, she said, but it would have been easier. Easier isn't the goal, he replied. Understanding is. There was a pause, then a soft laugh edged with tears. You really believe people can change, don't you? I have to, Adrian said. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Margaret whispered. I hope I prove you right. When the call ended, Adrian sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the hum of the city. Somewhere between the noise and the silence, he realized something. The story wasn't about humiliation or victory. It was about exposure. Light only hurts when it hits what's been hidden too long. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring press requests, interviews, debates, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of stillness. Outside, a plane soared overhead, its lights cutting through the clouds like truth-piercing denial. Adrian watched it until it vanished, then whispered, almost to himself, Here's to clearer skies. Morning broke over Washington. With a quiet hum of traffic and the scent of rain that hadn't quite fallen yet. The city looked calm from Adrian Cole's apartment window, rows of brick townhouses, the slow crawl of commuters, joggers moving along the river's edge, but beneath that calm, the world was stirring. His name was now everywhere. The television murmured in the background, showing a panel of commentators on screen. The clip from Flight 482 played again, Margaret Sloane's anxious accusation, the calm reveal of Adrian's FBI badge, the stunned silence that followed. Beneath it, bold text scrolled FBI agent confronts, racial profiling, mid-flight, calm, class, and courage. Adrian muted the sound. The headlines weren't the victory people thought they were. For him, it wasn't about pride, it was about pain finally being witnessed, and witnessing wasn't the same as change. His phone buzzed again this time, a call from Deputy Director Franklin Tate, his former supervisor at the Bureau. Adrian hesitated, then answered. Cole, Tate said, voice deep, measured, hell of a morning for you. Adrian gave a soft, dry laugh. That's one way to put it. I watched the footage, Tate said. Handled yourself with restraint. Proud of you for that. Adrian looked out the window, jaw set. Restraint shouldn't be a headline. Tate paused. No, but in this country, sometimes restraint from a black man still scares people more than anger. You know that better than anyone. Adrian said nothing. Tate continued. The Bureau's getting calls, media requests, civil rights groups, even the Department of Transportation. Seems your little flight might spark something big. Adrian frowned slightly. They want to use it, maybe, or maybe they want you to lead it. Ever heard of the phrase, the right voice at the wrong time? That's what I told them. But you can turn it into the right time. Adrian didn't answer right away. He stared at the city's skyline, at the way the morning light caught the Capitol dome like it was lit from within. Send me the proposal, he said finally. I'll read it. When the call ended, he sat in the stillness, feeling the weight settle deeper. He'd spent years building systems to protect information, but protecting people that was messier. Across town, Margaret Sloane sat at a diner, untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She'd missed her connection the night before, spent hours scrolling through comments online. Some were cruel typical Karen, lock her up. Others were performative sympathy, but one stuck with her. If she's truly sorry, she'll do something with it. The words echoed louder than the noise of guilt. She pulled out the notebook she'd bought at the airport and began to write. Day 1. I accused an innocent man because of fear. Fear, I thought, was instinct, but was actually ignorance. If I ever want forgiveness, I need to earn it. Her pen trembled as she wrote, but the act itself felt cleansing. Back at Helix Dynamics, the office buzzed with reporters outside. Eleanor Briggs handled them with the precision of a chess player measured words. Controlled tone. Inside, Adrian prepared for a private meeting with Senator Diane Holloway, who chaired the Civil Aviation Ethics Committee. When she arrived, she shook his hand firmly. Dr. Cole, thank you for meeting with me. I'll be direct. Your name carries weight right now. I want to use that to launch an initiative. He gestured for her to sit. You mean to prevent what happened on Flight 482 from happening again? Exactly, she said. We've been pushing for transparency protocols, body cams for security officers, complaint review boards, but without public momentum. It's been stagnant. Your story could push it through. Adrian leaned back, studying her face. And what happens when the news cycle moves on? She hesitated. That's why we need someone with authority, someone who understands both the system and the human side. He smiled faintly. You're recruiting me, Senator. I'm inviting you, she said. The difference is whether you're ready. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, but the weight behind them wasn't. I'll help, he said finally, but only if this becomes more than another PR bandage. Her eyes softened. That's why I came to you. Later that afternoon, as Adrian walked out of the Capitol, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. He paused on the steps, watching people hurry by, all with their own destinations, their own invisible battles. That night, in his office, Eleanor entered quietly, holding her tablet. The Clear Flight Project proposal is ready, she said. Public training programs, bias accountability reports, a digital transparency network. We even have early pledges from 2 airlines. Adrian looked at the logo she'd designed, a simple pair of open wings outlined by light. It's a start, he murmured. Eleanor smiled. You always say that. But you know, beginnings are the hardest part. He nodded, then leaned back, eyes weary. The irony. I spent years catching hackers who hide behind anonymity. And yet prejudice, it hides in plain sight, right behind polite smiles. Eleanor sat down across from him. Maybe that's why you're the right one to expose it. Adrian didn't respond, but his silence was full of thought. Elsewhere, in a quiet hotel room, Margaret watched the same news broadcast. Adrian's calm face filled the screen as he spoke at a small press conference. We talk about safety in the skies, he said, his voice steady. But true safety doesn't come from fear. It comes from understanding. You can't protect passengers if you're profiling them. You can't ensure peace when prejudice boards the plane disguised as caution. Margaret's throat tightened. She'd expected anger or revenge. But his words carried neither. They carried grace and accountability. When the anchor added, Dr. Cole's new Clear Flight project aims to bring awareness training to aviation staff nationwide. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time since that flight, she felt something close to relief. Maybe she could help. Maybe she should. The next morning, she sent an email to the project's public inbox. Dear Dr. Cole, I don't expect a reply, but I'd like to volunteer, not to cleanse guilt, but to learn and teach others not to become me. Adrian saw the message hours later, scrolling through a sea of congratulations and outrage. That one stopped him. He didn't respond. Not yet. But it made him pause longer than any headline. Weeks passed. The Clear Flight project gained traction. Airlines began signing on, one by one. What started as a viral clip was turning into policy quietly, persistently, like roots breaking through concrete. Yet, beneath the progress, Adrian felt a constant pull, a reminder that change didn't erase what had happened. Every meeting, every speech carried the echo of Margaret's trembling voice. He's acting strange. Sometimes at night, he'd hear that phrase in his mind and wonder how many others still whispered it in silence. But he also remembered the look on her face at the end and the beginning of awareness. That, he realized, was the seed of transformation. One evening, Eleanor entered his office again, this time smiling wider. You should see this, she said, handing him her tablet. On the screen was a short video clip, Margaret Sloan standing in front of a small community class, speaking softly to a group of airport staff. Her voice shook, but her words didn't. I once believed fear kept me safe, she said. But fear made me dangerous. What I did to that man changed me, and I'm here because he chose to teach, not destroy. The room was silent when she finished, and Adrian felt something shift inside him, a quiet exhale, like release. He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him carefully. You did that, she said. He shook his head slowly. No, she did. That night, he walked along the Potomac under a silver sky. The wind was cool, steady, carrying the scent of water and earth. He thought about how justice wasn't always loud or instant. It was often patient, unfolding in people who dared to look at themselves honestly. As he reached the bridge, a plane roared overhead, lights blinking through mist. He watched it disappear into the clouds and whispered, almost to himself, maybe now we can fly a little clearer. The first snow of the season dusted over Washington like a soft whisper, settling on rooftops and sidewalks, muffling the usual city noise. Dr. Adrian Cole sat by his office window, a mug of black coffee untouched beside him. The city looked peaceful from here white. Still, clean, but he knew better than to mistake quiet for calm. Underneath that blanket of snow, tension always stirred. Helix dynamics had become a focal point of national discussion. The Clear Flight project was no longer just a proposal. It was a movement. Airlines were adopting its transparency model. Training programs were rolling out, and passengers were sharing their own experiences online with the hashtag #FlyClear. Some stories were painful, others hopeful. Adrian read them all. One caught his attention that morning. A young flight attendant wrote last week, a passenger refused to sit beside a Muslim woman. My supervisor used the Clear Flight protocol. We stood firm. The flight took off with both passengers on board. It was peaceful. Thank you. Dr. Cole. Adrian's throat tightened. That was the kind of change that mattered, not the noise, but the quiet victories. His assistant, Naomi Green stepped in with her usual crisp energy. "Sir, the media team from CNN is here. They're setting up in conference room B." Adrian sighed softly. "Another interview?" Naomi smiled. "The good kind. You've got people listening. Adrian, they're not just watching the clip anymore, they're watching what you do next." He nodded and stood, adjusting his tie. "Then, let's give them something worth watching." The interview went smoothly. Questions about leadership, responsibility, forgiveness. But one question stuck with him after the cameras shut off. The reporter, a young man named Ethan Hall, had asked, "Dr. Cole, do you think people can really change, or do they just learn to hide their prejudice better?" Adrian had paused for several seconds before answering. "I think people can change when they're willing to feel shame without turning it into defense. Shame, when faced honestly, becomes reflection, and reflection becomes reform." Now, hours later. He replayed that line in his mind as he walked home through the snow. He didn't know if it was true for everyone, but he hoped it was true for Margaret Sloan. He hadn't replied to her email yet, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. How do you respond to someone who saw your humanity too late? That night, his wife, Olivia, found him at the kitchen counter, scrolling through articles. "You're thinking too loud again," she teased, setting a bowl of soup in front of him. He smiled faintly. "You know me too well." She sat beside him, brushing snow from her coat sleeve. "You're changing the world. Adrian, I can see it, but I also see what it's costing you." He looked at her, tired eyes meeting gentle ones. Every step forward feels like dragging a mountain. And yet, if I stop, that mountain stays on someone else's shoulders. Olivia reached for his hand, then dragged it together. It was a small thing, that touch, that sentence, but it grounded him more than any headline ever could. 2 days later, Adrian stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University. Students, reporters, and civic leaders filled every seat. Behind him, a banner read "The Clear Flight Forum, Fear, Bias, and the Future of Travel." When he took the stage, the applause was polite but curious. Many had come expecting anger or fire. What they got was something deeper, quiet conviction. He began. "I didn't ask to become a symbol. I boarded a plane to go home. That's all. But somewhere between that gate and my seat, I became a threat in someone else's story. And what I realized is that some people don't see color as skin. They see it as a warning label. And that has to end." The room fell utterly silent. He continued, his tone even but firm. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in repair, in systems that don't just punish ignorance but educate it." After the forum, a flood of students surrounded him, some with tears, others with gratitude. Among them, a young black woman in aviation school whispered, "Thank you for making me believe I can belong up there." Later that night, Adrian returned to his office to find Eleanor Briggs waiting with her tablet. "We just got confirmation," she said, excitement in her voice. "Congress is drafting the Passenger Dignity Act. They want your input on its ethical framework." He leaned back in disbelief. "Legislation." Eleanor grinned. "You wanted more than PR. Looks like the system's listening." Before he could respond, Naomi stepped in, holding an envelope. "This came for you, sir." Hand-delivered. Adrian took it, curious. Inside was a short handwritten letter, Dr. Cole, My name is Margaret Sloan. You may not remember me, but I'll never forget you. I've started working with a local community center. We're hosting workshops on confronting bias. I thought you should know it began with your story. Thank you for not humiliating me when you had every right to. It made me see what grace can do. Sincerely, Margaret. He read it twice, then set it down quietly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Eleanor watched him, then asked softly, "Are you okay?" He nodded, but his voice trembled slightly. "Yeah, I think for the first time in months I actually am." 3 weeks later, Adrian flew again. This time, not as a symbol or CEO, but as a man returning home. He boarded a flight from D.C. to Denver, wearing a simple jacket, no entourage, no media. The gate agent smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Cole." He smiled back. "Just Adrian today, please." In first class, a middle-aged man in a business suit gave him a brief nod. Nothing more. No glances, no whispers, no suspicion. Just two passengers, equal in silence. Halfway through the flight, a flight attendant approached. "Dr. Cole, sorry. Adrian, the captain, asked if you'd mind a quick word in the cockpit after landing." He raised an eyebrow, but agreed. When the plane touched down, he stepped into the cockpit to find a young Latina captain smiling. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Your project helped me keep my job. I was once accused of being too emotional to fly. Now I train new recruits on empathy protocols." Adrian smiled, genuinely moved. That's the kind of turbulence I don't mind causing. As he left the cockpit, passengers began to recognize him. A few clapped softly, others nodded with quiet respect, but he waved them off, almost shyly. Outside the airport, the air was crisp with winter sunlight. He called Olivia. "I just landed. Good flight?" she asked. He hesitated, then laughed softly. For once, yeah, it was peaceful. And in that simple peace, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of closure. Not from vindication, but from restoration. That night, while walking through the Denver snow, he opened Margaret's letter again. The ink had smudged slightly from his fingertips, but the words were still clear. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe people really can change." Overhead, another plane soared through the night sky, its lights cutting through the darkness like hope itself, steady, quiet, unyielding. A year had passed since that morning flight changed the course of Adrian Cole's life. In that time, his name had become synonymous with reform, empathy, and quiet power. But beneath all the applause, there was still a flicker of unrest, a question that kept whispering inside him whenever the world went still. What if that day had gone differently? What if he hadn't had the badge? It was early spring when the question found its answer. Adrian was in Los Angeles, speaking at a leadership summit about corporate accountability. The event hall was a swirl of polished shoes, cameras, and conversations that sounded more rehearsed than real. Yet when Adrian took the stage, his voice calm, deep, measured, cut through the noise like truth through fog. "Progress," he said, "isn't the absence of bias, it's the presence of courage to confront it." The crowd rose in applause, but Adrian barely registered it. What mattered most weren't the headlines, it was the ripple, the unseen, unfilmed moments where change was actually lived. After the event, a young woman approached him, holding a folder close to her chest. "Dr. Cole," she said, voice shaking slightly. "My name's Tanya Brooks. I'm a flight attendant. I wanted to thank you for the protocols you helped create. They saved my job last month." He smiled, genuinely curious. "What happened?" Tanya swallowed. A passenger accused a Middle Eastern man of being a threat. My supervisor froze. But I remembered what I learned from the clear flight training. You look at behavior, not appearance. I stood by him. Turned out he was a professor heading to a peace conference. Adrian nodded slowly, something warm settling in his chest. "That's how the system's supposed to work." She smiled back, eyes bright. "You gave me the courage to do the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable." When she left, he stood still for a moment, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. For the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the work was actually working. That night, his flight back to D.C. was delayed by 3 hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he waited at gate 23B, he scrolled through his phone, reading the day's messages, congratulations, invitations, requests for interviews, yet one message stood out, buried among the noise. It was from Margaret Sloan. She'd written, "I've been volunteering at a women's shelter. We're hosting a forum on implicit bias. Would you speak at it?" He smiled faintly, typing his reply. "Yes, not as a symbol, but as a man who believes people can change." By the time he boarded, it was nearly midnight. The cabin lights were dim, the air thick with fatigue. Adrian found his seat 2A this time and settled in, closing his eyes. The engines began their low hum. Then came a voice. "Excuse me, are you Dr. Cole?" He looked up to see a young man in uniform, Air Marshal Eli Turner. "I'm a big admirer, sir. Read everything about the Clear Flight Act." Adrian smiled politely. "Appreciate that. I just hope one day none of it will be necessary." Eli chuckled softly. "Wouldn't that be something?" The flight took off into a blanket of stars, smooth and quiet, but peace rarely stayed long at 30,000 feet. 2 hours in, as most passengers slept, Adrian noticed a commotion near row 8. A woman stood, pointing at a dark-skinned man with a backpack. Her voice, sharp and trembling, sliced through the cabin. "He's acting strange. He keeps checking his bag. I saw him muttering something." The cabin stirred awake, murmurs spreading like fire. Adrian felt his heart sink. It was happening again. The flight attendants rushed over. The accused man, middle-aged, Indian, nervous, held up his hands. "Please, I was only praying quietly. I meant no harm." But fear had already taken over. The woman insisted. "You have to check his bag. I won't sit down until you do." Eli Turner, the air marshal, stepped in, calm but firm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. Sir, may I ask what's in the bag?" The man nodded quickly. "It's food for my son. Homemade. We're moving to Chicago." Adrian stood before he even realized it, his voice steady but commanding. "Officer Turner, may I assist?" Eli turned, recognizing the quiet authority in his tone. "Dr. Cole, of course." Adrian approached, looking at the woman first. "Ma'am, has this man threatened you?" She hesitated. "No. But has he raised his voice?" "Made physical contact, displayed a weapon." She faltered. "No, but you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Adrian said softly. "You're afraid of what you don't recognize, but fear isn't evidence, and assumptions aren't security." The woman looked around, realizing half the cabin was watching. Her confidence wavered. Adrian turned to the Indian man, his tone gentle. "Sir, may I see what's inside your bag? I'll do it personally." The man nodded gratefully, unzipping it to reveal wrapped flatbread, a small jar of chutney, and a toy car. Nothing more. Adrian held up the toy car. "Dangerous, isn't it?" he said dryly. A ripple of awkward laughter broke the tension. The woman's face flushed crimson. I didn't mean." Adrian met her eyes, the echo of another flight flashing through his mind. "You didn't mean harm, but you caused it anyway. That's how bias works. It doesn't announce itself. It disguises as concern." Eli stepped in, lowering his voice. "Sir, you handled that perfectly." Adrian shook his head. "Handled isn't enough. It shouldn't keep happening." When the plane landed, passengers thanked him quietly. The Indian man stopped at the door. "You didn't just protect me," he said softly. "You protected everyone who looks like me." Adrian smiled faintly. Then it was worth standing up. Later, as he walked through the terminal, reporters waiting for other stories recognized him. Cameras turned, microphones lifted, but he waved them off. "Not tonight," he said. He called Olivia as he stepped into the cold night. "Another incident?" she asked gently. "Yeah," he said, voice low, "but this time it ended differently. No badge, just words. And it was enough." That night, in his hotel room, he wrote in his journal, a habit he'd kept from his FBI days. His handwriting was slow, deliberate. Justice doesn't live in titles. It lives in the moments we choose not to stay silent. Today reminded me of that. He closed the notebook, stared out at the city lights, and thought of Margaret Sloan, of Tanya Brooks, of every person who had once been silent but now chose to speak. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from Margaret again. It was a photo of her standing at a podium in a small community hall, speaking to a crowd of mixed ages and colors. The caption read, "People can change. I'm living proof." Adrian smiled, setting the phone down. Outside, a plane roared overhead, its contrail streaking across the dawn like a silver promise. He whispered to himself, "Maybe that's what real flight is, not escaping the world, but rising above what used to hold you down." 6 months later, the air in Washington, D.C., carried the first warmth of summer. The cherry blossoms had faded, but their memory lingered like something sacred brief, beautiful, and worth the wait. In a quiet corner office overlooking the Capitol, Dr. Adrian Cole sat before a room full of lawmakers, industry leaders, and press cameras. The congressional hearing on aviation bias reform was about to begin. He straightened his tie, the one Olivia had chosen for him that morning, a deep navy silk with faint silver lines, like threads of calm in a storm. When the chairman called his name, Adrian rose, steady as stone, and approached the microphone. "Dr. Cole," the chairman began, "you were the man at the center of the Phoenix incident. Since then, your work has inspired national change. But let's ask the question on everyone's mind, has the system truly changed?" Adrian looked up, scanning the room. Senators leaned in. Cameras blinked red. He exhaled slowly. "The system doesn't change through policy alone," he said. "It changes when fear loses its authority. And that takes more than a law. It takes accountability, empathy, and memory." He paused, letting silence stretch just long enough. We can't legislate human decency, but we can make it impossible to hide prejudice behind procedure. The words landed like a quiet storm. Across the table, a familiar face watched him, Margaret Sloan, the once accuser, now sitting as a civil rights advisor. Their eyes met, and she gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they both had come. After the session, reporters crowded him. "Dr. Cole, will you run for office?" one asked. He smiled faintly. "No, my work is better done from the ground." That evening, back at his home in Arlington, Olivia waited by the porch light, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. The smell of honey drifted in the air. "You did it," she said softly as he joined her. He chuckled. "I spoke. That's all. You didn't just speak, Adrian. You made them listen." He leaned back, gazing up at the fading sky. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "how one morning, one accusation, could rewrite everything?" Olivia smiled sadly. "It didn't rewrite you. It revealed you." They sat in silence for a while, the cicadas humming their steady song. Later that week, he received a letter in the mail, handwritten in trembling cursive. It was from Rhonda Blake. "Dr. Cole, I saw you on TV today. I don't deserve to speak to you, but I want you to know I've been trying. I volunteer at a community center now. We talk about fear, how it grows when we don't name it. Thank you for not hating me when you had every reason to. That moment changed my life." Adrian folded the letter carefully and placed it in his journal. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The following month, he returned to St. Louis for a new project, a collaboration with local airports to implement bias response teams. The media called it the Skyline Initiative, but to Adrian, it was simply unfinished business. At the launch event, Tanya Brooks introduced him to a group of new recruits, diverse, eager, nervous. "These are the first-generation trainees," she said proudly. "They've studied your work." Adrian smiled warmly. "Then the future's in good hands." One young man raised his hand. "Sir," he asked, "how do you stay calm when people look at you like you don't belong?" Adrian thought for a moment before answering. "Because I know who I am," he said quietly. "And the moment you know that, no one can unseat your dignity." Afterward, as he stood by the terminal window watching planes ascend into the dusky sky, he saw something unexpected: Margaret Sloane walking toward him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. She smiled, her posture lighter, her eyes clearer. "I wanted to see where it all began." They stood side by side, watching a family board, a plain father, mother, 2 children laughing, one holding a toy car. "I used to see fear in everything unfamiliar," Margaret said softly. "Now I see stories. Everyone's carrying one." Adrian nodded. "That's how empathy starts. You stop asking, 'What are you?' and start asking, 'What happened to you?'" Margaret glanced at him, her eyes shining. "You gave me my second chance. I intend to spend it right." He smiled gently. "Then we both did something right." A soft announcement echoed overhead: final boarding call for Flight 322 to Washington. D.C. Adrian turned to her. "That's me." She extended her hand. "Safe travels, Dr. Cole." He shook it firmly. "No, safe world. Ms. Sloane." As he walked toward the gate, a memory surfaced: the frightened woman in row 8, the Indian man clutching his son's toy, the murmurs of fear that had once defined the sky. But now, those murmurs were fading, slowly, tangibly, on board. As the plane climbed into the clouds, he gazed out the window. The world below shimmered in streaks of gold and gray. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver pin, a miniature set of wings, engraved with a single phrase: "Dignity is altitude." He smiled, fastening it to his lapel. When the attendant passed, she paused, recognizing him. "Dr. Cole," she whispered, "It's an honor." He shook his head gently. "The honor's yours," he said. "You're the ones flying this change forward." Hours later, as the plane descended through soft clouds, Adrian felt something inside him settle. For the first time since that day in Phoenix, the sky didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. As he stepped into the terminal, his phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Dinner's ready. And yes, I made your favorite." He smiled, typing back. "Tell our sky it can rest now." Outside, a child pointed upward at a departing jet. "Look, Mom, it's flying so high." Adrian paused, following the child's gaze. His reflection caught faintly in the terminal glass, older, wiser, unburdened. He whispered, almost to himself, "So are we, far above." The clouds parted, and for a brief, fleeting second, sunlight poured over everything: the runway, the city, the man who once had to prove his worth just to stay seated. Now, he no longer had to prove anything at all, because justice, at its truest form, had already taken flight. At its core, the story reminds us that dignity is not given, it's lived. Dr. Adrian Cole's calm strength showed that real power doesn't come from authority or titles, but from choosing integrity when anger would be easier. His story mirrors the quiet struggles many face every day, the moments when prejudice whispers louder than truth, when kindness must fight through fear. For older generations who have seen the world change yet watched injustice persist, this story is a call to remember progress begins with awareness. Every gesture, every word, every act of empathy is a chance to teach those who come after us what respect really looks like. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all forgiveness isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the act of freeing ourselves from the weight of others' ignorance while still demanding accountability. May we all learn to carry ourselves with the quiet courage of Adrian Cole to rise, not in anger, but in grace. Thank you for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this remind us that compassion and courage still matter in today's world. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real, powerful stories that inspire reflection, healing, and hope. Together, we can keep these conversations alive because dignity, empathy, and justice should never go out of style.